Yes, thank you. Thank you for introducing us, Paul. So basically, I'm the PI on this project, and Zy is the postdoc working with me on this project. So Zy, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, yeah. So this is basically an ESRC typical open call standard grant project that we won 2.5 years, 3 years ago, which will be finishing up by the 30th of June. And the project title is actually a UK-Ireland investigation into the statistical evidence base underpinning adult learning and education policy making. And if you're interested in the broader project, then you can go to adultlearningpolicies.co.uk. That's our website. And we also put in a QR code. So if you just scan it, but you can also click on the link, then that's where you find it. So this was, we were awarded £600,000 full economic costing for this project. And as I said, we're now in the final stages. We have to wrap it up by the end of June. So Zy, if you can go to the next slide. Now, for today, we're actually mainly going to focus on the work that we did in work package 2, but I just want to take 2 minutes to situate our second work package within the full project. And work package 1 is actually something we have already finalized. We're about to publish a paper on the results of work package 1, which sits in a special issue published by International Journal of Lifelong Education. We actually received the proofs, I think, today, or will receive them tomorrow. But for the first work package, we actually looked into different survey questionnaires that we have that have a measure on participation in adult education and training. And we did a review on how the results of these surveys actually contradict each other or are similar to each other. And the reason why you see quite a bit of fluctuation in the data is because the survey questions are formulated differently, their sampling approaches are different. So because of these underpinning framework that we used on the total survey error paradigm, you can actually see that there's more need for streamlined data. So that was the first work package. But then in the second work package, we focused on one specific survey data set. And Zy, in the next slides and the rest of the presentation, will talk about that more. But that is actually a data set that has been collected and is still being collected more or less on an annual basis. And because it has a streamlined question on participation in adult education and training, we could do some trends analysis on that. But I leave the technicalities to Zy. Now, we're also still working on our third work package. And for the third work package, we really want to know, like, okay, nowadays there's quite a lot of data out there on education and training issues, but how do the policymakers and the stakeholders actually use those insights from the data to prepare and select and implement their adult learning policies, with a specific interest on finding out whether policymakers and stakeholders in England versus Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and in the Republic of Ireland as well, have different approaches to, working with data evidence. We have wrapped up work package 2 by now. We're actually going to launch the report on the 1st of May. It's finished, but we wanted to wait until after the Easter weekend. So on the 1st of May in the morning, we'll launch the reports. And then during lunchtime, we will have an online webinar in which we're going to give a very detailed overview of the results and the recommendations for future research. So if you're interested in that, you can register using that link. But as I said, for today, we're really focusing on the technicalities of working with the cross-sectional data. And that is the point where I'm going to hand over to Zy, who's giving you a further update on what this APiL survey really is about and how to work with it. Over to you, Zy.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. Right, so just to give you a quick outline of today's presentation, I'm going to give a quick background on the APiL survey. I know Ellen already talked a little bit about that. And then afterwards, the technical aspect, I'll give an overview of how we harmonize 20 years worth of data from the APiL survey. And in this section, the demonstration will actually consist of me just showing you screenshots. But if you like an actual demonstration, if we have time, I can do that in the Q&A portion. Okay, so, right. So the APiL survey, as Ellen said, is an annual survey that is conducted by the Learning and Work Institute. So this has been ongoing. APiL stands for Adult Participation in Learning. It has an annual sample of about 5,000 to 6,000 adults in the UK. And one important thing to note is that there's been variation in the data collection methods across these 20 years. So for example, APiL started, with like interview, like having the survey as interviews either in person or over the telephone, but then that later had to move to fully online in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The other thing to note is when you analyze the APiL dataset, the Learning and Work Institute apply a weighting variable to make sure that the sample is representative of the UK population in terms of its socio-demographic characteristics. So we did the same in our analyses, and I'll say a little bit more about the weighting variable that we use for the harmonized data set later on. Right. So this paper from Darlington and colleagues is actually part of the recommended reading, and I find it to be a really useful paper. In fact, our process for harmonizing the data, we based it on their approach. So again, we got access to the APiL survey from 2002 to 2023. And since it's the leading adult survey in the UK, it was pretty exciting to get that much data. That was like 20 years worth of data. And if you combine the sample, that's about 110,000 people if you take like 5,000 to 6,000 people per year. The thing is, when you work with such a large scale data set, or even something that, spans years, you will inevitably encounter issues, like, as I mentioned, changes in the method of survey data collection, but also in terms of the inconsistencies in questions. Sometimes questions are there in one year, but not in another year. Or the wording of the questions will change, or even the response options for the question will change. And, that's unavoidable in large scale surveys because if you distribute them regularly, for example, annually, they also reflect changes in the context, right? So that's why they undergo revisions. So Darlington and colleagues encountered the same issue when they were wanting to analyze the health survey for England. So they wanted to analyze data from 1998 to 2011, and they encountered these problems. And so they decided that okay, they need to find a way to harmonize this, and they wrote this paper, which I do highly recommend. So this is an overview of the steps that Darlington and colleagues have for harmonizing data. So they have 6 steps. So first, well, it's about downloading the data set. Second, identifying variables of interest. Third is harmonizing and recoding. 4 is extracting all of these variables into a new data set. And 5 is about, thinking about before you analyze, what are the things you need to consider, and then finally going through the analysis. So I just wanted to show you the original flow chart from them. But in the next slide, this is how we actually applied that in working with the APiL datasets. So step 1, well, the Learning and Work Institute gave us the datasets for each year from 2002 to 2023, except for 2016 when the APiL survey was not run, and then in 2020 because of a change in the data collection method to fully online, they decided not to include that in the data set to give us. In the next few slides, I will actually go through more detail of each step, but what I want to highlight here is, when you look at this flow chart, it looks very neat, and you think it's a very straightforward process to harmonize a data set, but it's not. It's really a lot of work to clean the data and to harmonize it. To be honest, it took longer than expected. And I'm not saying this to discourage you, but it's more to temper your expectations and not be too hard on yourself when you take longer to work through a particular data set. I think that the importance of getting to know your data set and data cleaning in quantitative research tends to be overlooked and underestimated, but it is a very important process. So I'm saying this because I want you to be patient when you're doing it, because once you've done it, the analyses will be really fast and you can do cool stuff. I'll show you examples of those cool analyses later on in the presentation. Okay, so let's go back to the steps. So step 2, it's about identifying your variables of interest. So we did this first of all by exploring the APiL dataset, as in what variables are there to begin with. And then we use relevant existing literature and our project objectives as guidelines to select the variables we wanted to include. When I say getting to know your data set, an example I can give you is, so for example, in terms of demographic variables. So in adult participation and learning, we know that according to literature, educational attainment is a key variable to consider because people with higher educational attainment tend to also participate in learning later on. But when we looked at the APiL survey, they actually did not always ask the specific question on educational attainment. Instead, there was a question on what age they were when they left full-time education. And so we decided to use that as a proxy for educational attainment. Now we know that's not a perfect proxy, but it is what we could work with. So again, I'm just repeating that because it's important to get to know your data set. What's in it, what's not there. If it's not there, what can you work with? So let's move on to step 3. So once you've decided on the variables that you're interested in, then you can start recoding and harmonizing them. So for this, you can actually use any software that you like. In our case, we used Excel and SPSS. So the top row here is an extract of my Excel spreadsheet. And then the bottom row is an extract of my SPSS syntax. So I'll show you the screenshots of this later on, but I'm just summarizing this for you right now because what I want to highlight here is, so in my Excel spreadsheet, you don't actually necessarily have to do this when you're harmonizing or recoding, but I did it because if you actually compare the two, at least I find it easier to actually understand what is going on in the Excel spreadsheet because these two things are actually telling you the same thing. So in the Excel spreadsheet, you have the old variable. This was the question that was asked. These were the options in the old variable. And then the new variable in the harmonized data set, that's what I called it. And then these are the new options. Now to recode it, this is the actual syntax in SPSS. So like I said, I find it easier to read the top row in terms of interpreting what is going on. And then this is like the technical thing that goes behind, like it's the backdoor stuff that happens to get you to recode that data. Okay, and then for steps 4 and 5, here I actually combined them because I think they overlap. So recapping Darlington and colleagues, step 4 is about extracting the variables, and step 5 is about the considerations you want to think about before you analyze your data. So once we selected all our variables, recoded them, in the end, we ended up with about 29 main variables in the harmonized data set. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you details of the demographic variables and the 9 APiL participation related variables. But I want to point out here that in the harmonized data set, we included 3 dataset information related variables. So remember, we got the APiL data set for each year. So that means we had 20 different data sets, and the whole idea of harmonizing is to combine them all in one big data set. So in the original data sets, of course, each respondent had an ID number, but in the harmonized data set, we included that and actually included the year, just so it's easier to, cross-check if you ever need to look at the raw files, the original files, and the harmonized data set to make sure everything is consistent. Secondly, the weight year. So as I mentioned earlier, the Learning and Work Institute uses a weighting variable per year. So we still included that in the harmonized data set in case we wanted to run specific analyses for a specific year only. But we did recompute a master weight variable, which we called, well, in this case, weight 5,500, because if you're going to analyze the harmonized data set, you need to think about, well, what weighting will we use if it's all of that combined data set? So that's what I mean when I say that steps 4 and 5 overlap, because when you're harmonizing it, you think one of the things that we really had to consider was, what are we going to do with the weighting variable once you combine each year? I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I'm happy to explain that later on. And so, as I mentioned, that's why in the total sample size, this is the weighted sample, we had 110,001 respondents. Okay. So this is just to give you an overview of the different demographic variables that we included in the harmonized data set. Okay, so we have age, gender, ethnicity, the nation or region, so on and so forth. What I want to point out here is that for the most part, these were the demographic variables that were pretty consistent from 2002 to 2023. We couldn't include some that were not consistent, basically. And then this is a summary of the different APiL participation variables. So we have a participation variable that asks about their participation. That was the one thing that was really consistent throughout the 20 years, the participation question. There was a question on future learning intentions. And then this is where we had to streamline a lot of the variables when we talk about motivations, benefits, challenges, provision, the fees, and also barriers. I'll show some examples of this in the next slide. So before, in terms of showing you the examples, I want to do that by actually highlighting, again, the challenges and how we dealt with these challenges. So just to say again, like similar to Darlington and colleagues, the primary challenge in harmonizing the APiL data was the lack of consistency in the APiL survey. And I want to give a quick note here. So this is a hyperlink that you can click later on. So in terms of data collection method, I mentioned that the APiL moved to a fully online survey later on. The common terms that you'll probably encounter when you work with surveys is like, well, these are acronyms, CAPI, CATI, and COWI. So CAPI stands for Computer Assisted Personal Interviewing, which is basically, you're doing a survey with an interviewer. The interviewer is the one asking you the questions, like face-to-face. CATI is computer-assisted telephone interviewing, which is the same thing as the face-to-face, except it's not, it's over the telephone. And COWI is computer-assisted web interviewing, which is your online survey that you take on your own via a web browser or a mobile app. So if you want to read about the pros and cons of that, you can click on this hyperlink later on. But the main challenge that we face in harmonizing the data set was the survey questions. As I mentioned, the availability, sometimes that question was there, sometimes it wasn't, the wording changed, and also the response option categories changed. So to address this, I'm going to show you the importance of clear documentation. And, clear documentation is important both for transparency and reproducibility. That's just part of good research practice. In this specific instance, we documented things via our technical note, our code book, and our syntax. And I will show you examples of this. Let's start with the technical note. Okay, so a technical note is generally a brief document that would provide key information about a specific topic. So the idea behind preparing a technical note in this case was to summarize and be transparent about our data harmonization approach so that people can understand how we arrived at the variables in the harmonized data set. In a way, it's practically like an easy to read manual. At least that's what I aimed for in creating the technical note. The idea here is that if I give you my technical note, the code book, the syntax, the dataset files, I want the person who has them to be able to understand and duplicate what I did, even if I'm not there to actually explain it. You know, this is the whole idea of reproducibility. So this is an excerpt from that for step 3, just explaining like our approach to that. And here, you see in step 4, I actually outlined the step-by-step process in extracting the variables. So just imagine if you had all of my files, the technical note says that, first of all, you open the original data set from the Learning and Work Institute. You save that as a new data set, you rename that data set, you add the year ID variable, you recode, you select the variables, and then you save that as a new variable. So that's like a summary of the steps. But then I also reference the SPSS syntax file because it's actually detailed in the syntax file. I'll show you a sample of the syntax file in a little bit. But I also want to highlight that the technical note also explains like annotations and symbols in the syntax file. So for example, when harmonizing the data set, the syntax was starting with APiL 2023 as the base file. So that's the first data set I open, and then I open 2022, 2021, so on and so forth. And then I put what my 3 asterisks mean. So that means that if you see that in my syntax, you have to do that step. The explanation of that step is denoted by just a single asterisk. So going back to this example of the inconsistencies, so in the technical note, we included a table that shows you, for example, that for the provision variable, so from 2002 to 2023, the phrasing in the APiL survey was pretty consistent in asking, how are you doing this learning? Or how did you do this learning? But for 2008, that question was not there. Instead, the question that was asked was, where is the main place that you did or do this learning? So as a team, we discussed this and we decided that this seems like a sensible alternate question or a proxy to find out how respondents were doing their adult learning and education course or whatever. Oops. So it's the same for the benefits. So again, there was this pretty consistent question that people were asked from 2002 to 2023. Respondents were asked, can you identify any changes or benefits that have happened as a result of your learning? But then from 2013 to 2015, that question, the wording was again a bit changed, but we deemed that these questions could be proxies for that because they were asking about work-related outcomes of your training. And when you look at the response options of this, actually, it was pretty similar to the response options of benefits. Like it was the same response categories. And this one is just to show you an example of what we did when the response option categories change throughout the years. So for example, when you look at the demographic variable on marital or domestic status, some years had more detailed options in terms of like separating, for example, divorce and widowed and then living with parents or living with other adults. But in other years, those options were not there. So what we did in recoding them was we combined, because some years actually had this combined already. And then we had an other category. You can see the same thing in terms of when they're asked where they're based. Is it like in an urban or rural area? Again, some years had an extra option, but most years only had two. So in the harmonized data set, we just went with the two categories. So, okay, codebook. Accompanying the technical note are Excel codebooks. And one of the Excel files I created is actually simply just listing the variables that we deleted for each year. I think, I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but for example, the APiL 2023 data set had about 393 variables. But if you remember, in our harmonized data set, we only had about like 29 main variables. So I just created this Excel file for documentation, like broke it down per year per sheet, just so if anyone wants to have a quick look at what variables are not in the harmonized data set for each year, it's there. They can easily go to that sheet and look for it. Like I mentioned earlier, this is actually also in the syntax. In fact, I literally just copy pasted the stuff from the syntax and put it in an Excel file. And again, I don't know if it's personal preference, but I just find that easier as well to read. I don't have to scroll through the long syntax. But this is the more useful code book in Excel. So first, our first sheet, we listed all of the variables that we have in the harmonized data set. So if you're familiar with SPSS, you can actually say, well, there's a variable view option in SPSS. There's a sheet there that already functions as a code book. But what's convenient about creating a code book in Excel is you can actually, filter things if you want to have a quick look at a specific variable. Like, okay, I want to know what are the different demographic variables that are there. I mean, I know right now you could easily see it here, but if you just wanted to filter that, and just show that, then you can. So that's why I actually added a theme column in here, just to help with filtering and sorting the variables. You don't see it in the screenshot here, but I also have like a notes column, more as notes to myself. Or if you're working with collaborators, like, so Ellen, I would leave her notes there or questions there as well. And then here is a summary of the recoding. So again, you can technically see all of this in the syntax. So I'll show you as an example of syntax later on. But Excel is just easier because you can filter if you just want to see, for example, by year, what are the variables there. Again, I put a column on the theme. So this is a screenshot of a syntax in SPSS for recoding specifically the 2023 APiL dataset. So in SPSS, you actually have the option of running analyses either by clicking and selecting options from a menu, like how you do in Word when you want to format your document, right? You go to, I don't know, format, paragraph, and then you click things. So you can do that in SPSS, or you can write a syntax, or you can actually do both, which is what I usually do. I find it easier to start by selecting options from the menu, and then SPSS gives you that option to copy paste the syntax into a syntax file that will then produce this. And that's how I got this file. As I mentioned earlier on, syntax is important not just for transparency and reproducibility, but it's actually really handy when you need to change or edit something. Instead of doing the whole clicking the menu all over again, if you have your syntax and you need to change something, you can just open your syntax file and then change it from there. This is handy as well in working with the APiL data set. Since we had like 20 years worth, I could simply just copy paste the syntax for 1 year and then use that for the other year and then just change things. Like, for example, instead of 2023, I'll put 2022. So yeah, so it's easy enough to copy paste the syntax, but what I would recommend getting into the habit of is leaving yourself notes within the syntax to remind you what that bit of code is actually doing. So if you use R, for example, you might be familiar with this. I know it's kind of tiny. I hope you can sort of see it, but so here I wrote myself notes. So first, you open the original data set and then you save the new data set. If you remember, this is kind of the same thing that was in the technical note. And then here I wrote that this is the syntax for renaming the data set. And then if you run this one, it activates that data set. So yes, it just explains what's happening, but I also note things such as a pre-step. So there were certain things I couldn't quite figure out, for example, how to do just by syntax, and I had to do it manually. But for the purposes of reproducibility and transparency, I put here, for example, pre-step, change ID from numeric to string. So before I run this syntax, I go to my file and I change the variable format or something from numeric to string before I can run the syntax. And yeah, again, I would sometimes leave notes for Ellen as well. So it's very handy, really. And the reason I recommend doing like the whole documenting this is because either future you or someone else will thank you for this. Because, especially if you're working with a large data set and, sometimes you leave it for a while and then because you get busy with other things, you revisit it. And if you don't have notes, you're like, what is happening here? But the notes, just help you keep track of everything. So this next syntax here is the excerpt for harmonizing the data set. So just to kind of clarify, so each APiL data set would have each year had its own syntax so that I can recode that particular data set for that year. And then when I want to combine them into my harmonized data set, this is what I did. So again, I outlined the steps. So first of all, you open the harmonized data set for 2023. I saved that as a new data set, which I called harmonized data set, APiL 2002 to 2023. I renamed the data set, and then I opened the data set for each year, and I renamed them as well. And then later on, the syntax combines all of that into your harmonized data set. Okay, so before I show you examples of the cool things that you can do with your harmonized data set, I again want to emphasize the importance of knowing your data set. Like I mentioned in the beginning, familiarizing yourself with the data set and then cleaning the data is often overlooked and even underappreciated in quantitative data analysis, but it's very, very important. And one way to get to know your data set is by running descriptive statistics, for example, to summarize the mean or the average, the frequencies. And of course, we did that to check the harmonized data set. And when we were doing that, one of the things that we notice is for the 2007 data on a specific question on motivations, it had so many missing items. So now a discussion about missing data and how to deal with that can be a separate lecture on its own. But for today's purposes, what I want to note is, the importance of knowing whether that data is missing because people just really skip that question because that could happen. But what you don't want is to have a bunch of missing data because there was an error in your recoding process. And so when we saw that about 98% of the data was missing for this particular variable, we did some detective work. So we actually went back to the original survey for 2007 because we had because the Learning and Work Institute also gave us the actual survey questions for each year. And going through that, we found that actually the reason that there's a lot of missing data for this particular variable is because this question was only asked for people in Wales. And that's why of the total sample, only 2% answered because that was basically the sample in Wales. So what we then did for the harmonized data set is to recode that missing data. I mean, the missing data, we recoded that as no data because there was no data because it was not asked from all to all those people who were not from Wales. So yeah, I just wanted to show you that example to give you an idea of the different things that you really need to consider when you are harmonizing data sets, or actually even if you're just working with data sets overall. And of course, we included this note in our technical note and everything, because that's, again, the importance of documentation for transparency and reproducibility. So assuming that, you did all of that, you have your harmonized data set, what is your reward? Your reward is you can do cool things like trends analysis. So we combined all of that data from 2002 to 2023. And here's an example that we were able to actually, for example, show the trends of participation rates by year. Now, I'm not going to discuss the information in each graph because we're focusing more on the technical aspect here, but just wanted to show you examples. And also, if you are interested actually in learning more about this, register for our webinar. I'll show you the link to that again later on. Just showing you other examples here. This one shows you the probability of participation for each year, comparing the highest probability group and the lowest probability group. And this one I just want to show you because it's one of the really interesting things that we found. So we had data so as I said, we had data from 2002 to 2023, and now we decided to compare pre-COVID and post-COVID years. So we have, on the one hand, 2017, 2018, 2019, and then 2021, 2022, 2023. Not gonna go into the detail, but just to maybe help you become more interested in attending our webinar on the 1st of May. If you look at, you see shifts basically in the trends pre and post-COVID. And one example that I really find interesting is when people were asked about barriers for taking part in adult participation, in adult learning, pre-COVID, like about less than 10% selected the option they felt that they were too old. But then post-COVID, where's my cursor? But then post-COVID, that like almost kind of more than doubled to over 20%. I don't know. I just find myself really curious about that. I mean, did COVID make people feel too old? I'm not sure. But like I said, if you're interested to learn more about these trends that we managed to basically unpack with our harmonized data set, please register for our webinar. The QR code is here. The URL is there. If you want to stay updated about the project, this is the QR code for the website. And again, that's the link. The recommended reading is there, but I'll go back to the QR code link. Yeah, I'm open to questions because the whole idea of harmonizing data sets, it's very specific to the data set you're working with, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what we did. And if you have specific questions, I think that might be more helpful for me and Ellen to answer.